IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Sachin Kalbag. I'm Senior Fellow at Takshashila Institution. This is how my Takshashila colleague Anushka Saxena prefaced her recent opinion piece on BRICS, the grouping of the five emerging economies of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The 15th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa concluded on 24th of August. BRICS Chair President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, in the media briefing following the conclusion of the summit, announced the addition of six new members: Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, and the membership would begin in January 2024. On the BRICS expansion, the five members are known to have divergent views. While China and Russia were keen to expand the bloc as a counter to the West, India's stance has been consensus, with guiding principles and criteria for the new members. In last year's Beijing declaration, the five member states had decided on the expansion process, the need to clarify the guiding principles, standards, criteria, and procedures for this expansion process through the Sherpas channel based on full consultation and consensus. Now, President Ramaphosa said that the members have reached a consensus on standards and criteria and procedures, but did not spell them out. Now, why is the BRICS important? The BRICS, so far, even without the inclusion of the six members, has about 27% of the world's land surface and 42% of the global population. Brazil, Russia, India, and China are among the top 10 largest countries by population area and GDP, as per the PPP method of calculation. And the latter three are widely considered to be current superpowers or are still emerging at least. All five states are members of the G20 with a combined nominal GDP of $28 trillion, which accounts for 27% of the gross world product. A total PPP GDP of around $57 trillion or 33% of the global GDP as per the PPP method, and an estimated $4.5 trillion in combined foreign reserves. Now, the BRICS were originally identified for the purpose of highlighting investment opportunities, and they never were a formal intergovernmental organization in the beginning. But since 2009, they have increasingly formed into a more cohesive geopolitical bloc. Today, I have with me Anushka Saxena, who's a research analyst at Takshashila, but has done an very interesting op-ed on this particular expansion and what this means for the future of BRICS. Anushka, I want to start off with how BRICS has always been making decisions through consensus, but even with five members and China included, that consensus was a little difficult. Uh, with the inclusion of six new members, do you think decision making will be even tougher, if not impossible? And what is the future of BRICS after Jan 2024 in this context?
Right. Firstly, thank you so much for having me and for the introduction to the op-ed. I think BRICS has been all the rage when it comes to academic and strategic discussions surrounding the future of the grouping and its expansion to include six new members. I think even though, yes, the guidelines haven't been spelled out, there has been some valid speculation as to why some of these members were chosen. For example, Ethiopia, we know because it's the head of the African Union. The African Union is headquartered in Addis Ababa. Then you have Egypt, which is the second largest African economy after Nigeria. And of course, you have countries like UAE and Saudi Arabia and Iran because of the kind of geostrategic and oil related value that they bring, right? And yes, it is indeed true that decisions in the BRICS have been made through consensus. And while all the statistics and the numbers you talked about with regards to how much vitality the addition of these new members is going to bring to the grouping, the fact that they represent a huge chunk of the population of the world, they have a combined GDP of $27.6 trillion, so on and so forth. They also bring a lot of challenges with regards to how much more further away that consensus goes, right? Because even among those five members, the understanding was that China sees consensus structure as a constraint, but at the same time, it was absolutely essential to the brand value of BRICS, which was that all five countries, despite the differences in growth and GDP, were considered equal and had the same say in whatever decision the grouping made. This included discussions on issues of global importance like climate change and even developmental financing, which is one of the reasons why the NDB came up, right? To cater to the developmental financing needs of developing economies and emerging market countries, without necessarily having to go to these Western led institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Uh, but now again, with the introduction of these new members, um, consensus is going to be a problem because all of these new members bring different perspectives into the equation. For example, and this is adding on to the fact that there have been problems in the grouping from the past. For example, even though yes, there's a consensus based parallel flat structure in BRICS, China's indirect unspoken heft, because of the fact that it contributed 70% to the grouping's GDP, was kind of a problem for India, right? Similarly, South Africa, which was increasingly concerned about towing the line with regards to its relationship with the West, was also worried about the fact that the BRICS is positioning itself increasingly because of China's and Russia's perspectives on it, because of the speeches made by Putin and Xi Jinping in the past few months, that BRICS is becoming an increasingly anti-Western kind of an organization that wants to rival the G7 or the financial institutions that are headed by Western countries, right? And so these were problems for South Africa, and now they will be problems for the countries that have just come in too, right? Like Ethiopia and Saudi Arabia, who've shared very strong relations with the US in the past. And other concerns, of course, surround this need that is felt within the grouping to support Russia through its war in the Ukraine, directly or indirectly. For example, South Africa, China, they've all continued to conduct trade, especially in military equipment, with Russia, right? And so has India. And these have been these points have irked the West. So clearly, with the inclusion of more members, the voices that demand a say in global governance have expanded, and they have indeed given more legitimacy to BRICS. But at the same time, they have created challenges with regards to how easily these members can reach consensus and how their own rivaling interests can be brought together, whether it be with regards to what Russia is doing in Ukraine, whether it be with regards to the relations with the US and the West, or may it be with regards to China's growing heft and how to, counter the other voices in the world that are saying that China is becoming increasingly aggressive. So yes, it'll be like if you ask me about the geopolitical future of the BRICS organization that comes about with the induction of the formal induction of the new members in January 2024, I would say that any speculation with regards to this grouping becoming a rival to the G7 or the West would be uncalled for, because the first thing that they have to rival is their own internal disagreements. And yes, consensus will become a problem, but at the same time, the point when these countries will actually reach a decision, it will be the best common minimum that we can agree most developing countries will kind of agree on. So
People have been talking about when it comes to BRICS, given that China wants to expand or extend its heft to beyond just this particular grouping. For example, one of the big statements that China has made by not attending Xi Jinping, not attending the G20, for instance, in New Delhi later this month in September 2023. Uh, that also kind of speaks to China's wanting to dominate any grouping that it is part of, and India wanting to have any kind of aspirational heft, not only in BRICS but also because it is part of Quad. It is also part of G20. It was an invitee member to the G7 as well. Uh, Given that increasing geopolitical importance of India is also noticed by the West, this well, so-called battle between India and China perhaps may even dominate the BRICS decision making as well. What is your opinion on that?
I think that's absolutely valid, because this is very true with most of the organizations that India and China are together a part of, right? May it be um, the G20, which is much more broader, but also BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right?
Right.
Even though what China would advocate is that this is, an equitable platform where all countries are a pole, right? Even though China's usual stance is that it absolutely dismisses the idea that India is a pole in the regional or the multipolar world order, but it would kind of advocate this at the outset, right? But internally, that would always, or the bit, or what we read between the lines would always be that China wants the agenda to be led by its own understanding of the world order, its own relationship with the West, and most of the members it expects will kind of fall in line because of the kind of military and economic heft that it carries. It hasn't worked with BRICS so far. And the NDB has really been of help in that regard, because whatever 33 billion dollar investments have been made so far since the bank has come into place, it hasn't just been China financing these as developmental projects similar to what it would be doing under BRI or the GDI, but it has been a contribution in local currencies by all the five countries, and it's expected that the result will be similar with more members coming in. So but we do see it playing out in the SCO, and we do see it play out with with China's decision to kind of skip the G20 again. Of course, it's reported, and I think the foreign ministry spokesperson for China, Wang Wenbin, said that he cannot comment at the moment on who exactly from China will be attending, although we might be preparing to host Li Chang, who's the premier for China.
They've
If he
already announced, Anushka. They've already announced that Li Chang is going to come to New Delhi for the
Yeah,
G20.
yeah, right. So yeah, yeah, absolutely right. So like I said, we may be preparing to host Li Chang for the G20. I think not just with regards to what India's opposition may have been against China's view on consensus or on the West in BRICS. I think this is also a snub with regards to India lodging a protest against the release of the standard national map by China, which it did on August 28th, where it included the whole of our state of Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin as part of the Chinese territory. Of course, tensions are simmering on the border. We even with 19 core commander level talks, we haven't really seen um, as the two sides reaching a solution. And of course, then there are other more abstract aspirational ideas about view of the regional order and view of the West. So I think a lot of factors are combining here for Xi Jinping to kind of have made this decision. And of course, like you said, one of them is indeed the fact that it is simply not ready to accept that India has become an important player in the West, and India is advocating for an equitable platform for all other developing economies, which China just thinks are no better than as satellite states.
Yeah, because that's see, because China wants to have an increasingly important slash significant role in Africa, for instance. Even there, it wants to extend its influence to just beyond. Some of the West African states, but also into East Africa, Ethiopia being part of that, Kenya, where China has a huge amount of investments in West Africa, Nigeria, Niger, all these places where China has significant investments. Russia wants to extend. So, the playground for BRICS is just beyond what the economic development of these five nations is. It also becomes a very strategic geopolitical question. Not only for for the member countries, but also for countries that are not part of the BRICS grouping as yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're at Africa and the Middle East. In fact, we're seeing increasing Chinese influence with, say, first the deal that they signed with Iran for a $400 billion investment fund, and then more recently with the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia that is is said to be brokered by China. And even if the reality being that China swooped in at the last minute, and back channel talks had been going on between the two sides for years. That moment of opportunity was very important for China. So in both of these regions, Africa and the Middle East, we're seeing China trying to vie for influence. And I think Central Asia has just been kind of left out because of China's relationship with Russia, and the fact that it's understood that Central Asia remains Russia's under Russia's sphere of influence. But yes, I think one of the reasons why so many countries might also have wanted to join the BRICS grouping, apart from, I think Reuters reported that 40 countries had applied. Then I think an African official said that it's 23, and then ultimately six were inducted. So those that were inducted and have wanted to apply, the sentiment among some of them could indeed be that they would have easy access to capital, because when China gives out loans, it does not take into consideration things that the Western led institutions would, like what is the level of sovereign debt, whether or not there is corruption in the country, and how much there is a potential for the country to default. In fact, for China, it's a positive thing if the country defaults, so that they can take over some of their resources, for example, as it has done in Angola, which is an African country where China has taken over large swaths of oil blocks because Angola was unable to repay its debt to China under the BRI, right? So of course, and this was a concern with India too as well, right? When we advocated for guidelines and principles on the expansion, was because the concern is that China will use the platform, use its conversations with these newly inducted members to kind of put forth its own sphere of influence and agenda with regards to economic cohesion, and ultimately become this kind of financial alternative. So even though, yes, the BRICS agenda solely isn't financial alternative, a lot of coercive power rests with China because it has that kind of financial heft. And I think it's playing out both in Africa and the Middle East. And interestingly, you mentioned Africa, and the third China Africa Peace and Security Forum recently gave over. Even there, there was a discussion on China supporting Africa through traditional security issues like military coups and civil war. There was a military coup in Gabon recently. And so I think China is also going to position itself as the security guarantor in regions well beyond the Asia Pacific. So that's definitely a cause of concern for countries within the BRICS, but also for India and others that are not a part of BRICS in general.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how does India step up to this possible potential domination by China then? Because India has been aggressive, India has been hitting back at China in international forums, but when it comes to decision making, when it comes to influence of other countries in a grouping that is now very intimate in that sense, because it's still only 11 members, India's heft might be challenged when China speaks to other countries that are dependent on China, for instance.
Right. I think from India's perspective, the goal might not necessarily be to replace the dependence of some of these countries from and move it away from China to India, because I don't think we have that kind of economic or military resource or capacity to be able to achieve that. But at the same time, some of the things that we could do and we are actually acting upon is expanding our partnership with the West wherever we can to counter China without actually saying it, right? And even if we do see it, I think at this point the tensions are simmering so much that we have actually started saying it out loud as well, right? Which was a concern in the past. So I think these partnerships like the ISET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies with the United States, Indusex, which is a partnership on defense industrial complex, and whatever announcements were made with regards to India and the US jointly producing jet engines in India domestically after in the aftermath of Modi's US visit. I think these are good guarantors that we can create deterrence for China, and at the same time leverage our goodwill in the West to achieve outcomes for us, right? And when that happens, when other countries see us expand on our partnership with the West, I think it also earns goodwill for us in those countries. uh, then of course there is the use of organizations like BRICS and the SCO, right? Although SCO has been largely plagued by the tussle between India and China and India and Pakistan, uh, but at the same time BRICS hasn't been, right? And so BRICS continues to maintain that consensus based equitable platform brand value. So for India to leverage this grouping, and with the new members coming in, for India to create an environment that is hospitable for its own interests, I think that's great, right? And India is vying for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. A lot of the P5 member countries are already in support of it. Even Russia has, put forth support in it. And I think asking for support from these newly inducted BRICS countries in this regard can also push Indian interests in conventional international platforms where India has been vying for a stake for the longest time. So I think yes, those would be some things that I can think of, right? Given the resource crunch that we have with regards to, vis-a-vis, in comparison to what China can offer, I think we have some partnerships with the Western countries to rely on, as well as demanding greater support for a say in international institutions. And I think some of our work is also focused towards reducing our own vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China. I think we're doing some excellent work at Takshashila here on understanding what constitutes vulnerability in trade interdependence, and if we can reduce some of it, not from the kind of narrow-minded agenda of being completely self-reliant or atmanirbhar, but from a genuine perspective where we can see what sectors of the economy are susceptible to strategic and critical attacks from China in, say, times of crisis, or if these are perhaps necessary to develop for our own economic growth in the long run. Then I think that's also something that can significantly help us reduce Chinese influence domestically, and at the same time project this idea that we don't need to be dependent on China to other.
Right. Also, because India followed up the US state visit with a state visit to France as well. And the military equations that India has with both the US and France is significantly changed from what it was 20 years ago. India has always been a important strategic partner of France since 1998, and this year we celebrated 25 years of that strategic partnership. And clearly the state visit to France was aimed at taking forward that relationship to a next level, not only for this year but for the next 10 to 15 to even 20 years. In that sense, the American support for real time monitoring in across the China Indo-China border, that's also significant because India now gets real-time intelligence, along the border. So clearly, China is, and then of course there's the Quad, where India is quite involved with both Japan, and the US. Not so much Australia, but in terms of strategic alliance along the Indo-Pacific region, Australia also becomes an important partner. So in that sense, these groupings which go beyond BRICS, because we are strategic partners with America, we're strategic partners with France, we have a very good relationship in the Quad. This might have created a little bit of deterrence in the non-BRICS way for China. I mean, for India vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with regards to Quad, an important development is indeed the Malabar naval exercise that recently took place. Because for the longest time, India had been wary of Australia's participation in the exercise. First, it was bilateral between India and the US, then Japan came in, and then for a couple of years, Australia was trying to be a part of this exercise, but it didn't really happen. But the fact that this year, in August, Australia participated in this military exercise, and before that India conducted military exercises with ASEAN, even as Chinese vessels were there in the South China Sea attempting to threaten them. This is all proof that India is now mentally and militarily preparing itself to kind of face the China challenge, even in regions that may not be absolutely strategically important for India, like the South China Sea. Not immediately important, but not immediately. So I think we're working on that deterrence capacity, left, right, and center, including with a variety of actors outside of BRICS.
So in that sense, my reading earlier was that BRICS should not become like an India China forum. Uh, do you think that is likely to become like that, given that the other people do not have the same heft as India and China, and Russia, given its military relationship with both India and China, may not intervene in that sense. So would it be like a India faction versus a China faction there? Do you foresee that happening? Is it avoidable, or can it be avoided completely?
Right. I think that's a very interesting question. I haven't necessarily seen evidence in negotiations of in the BRICS to prove that the India-China rivalry has been kind of a hindrance or an obstacle for collaboration and deliberation in the BRICS. I think yes, both sides have used BRICS as a platform to kind of argue that India argues that BRICS expansion should be guided by principles and guidelines and shouldn't just become a way for influence peddling. China would say that we don't need a consensus structure, and you should just have a structure. You should acknowledge the hierarchy that exists, but at the same time, all states in one way or another use these groupings and multilateral institutions to advance their agenda, but this hasn't really played out in the form of an obstacle for BRICS, especially with regards to consensus, right? I haven't seen India because of the agenda of BRICS. For example, its discussions on climate and development finance, or its acknowledgement that there is a need to fund some investment projects in local currencies, because the agenda is so developmental, and both India and China want to position themselves as the voices of the global south. Instead of being competing, it has actually turned out to be collaborative. And it's hard to say what will happen with the induction of new members and how those dynamics will play out, but it is likely that with the different interests the members bring in, right? Some members want their relations with the West to be intact. Some members have increased have an expanded partnership with China, but at the same time really respect India and have a lot to look forward to in their partnership with India, especially with regards to access to Indian markets. These processes will kind of eventually balance out. However, like, just to conclude on this, I think um, for both nations, both India and China, it's important that they want to position themselves as the voice of the global south, and they want to advance their own interests, whether in BRICS or outside. It is indeed necessary that the border issue and the skirmishes and the internal tensions be resolved. But yes, again, I don't think, even if it isn't, as it hasn't been for a while, it will have a significant impact on the brand value and the dynamic of the BRICS.
The BRICS, the payment system, for instance, many of the countries around the world, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, want to have trade in local currencies.
Mm,
India wants to have buy Russian wheat or Russian oil using local currency.
mm,
India and the UAE have a similar arrangement. With the inclusion of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates into BRICS, do you think there will be some kind of strategic involvement of in terms of oil, a trade of oil between India and the Middle East? When it comes to using local currencies, will this get a boost in that sense?
uh, well, again, that remains to be seen. I think the arrangement on, say, a currency for BRICS, or having one BRICS currency replace the dollar or encourage de-dollarization is something that India necessarily hasn't supported, even though yes, China did put this proposal forth with much rigor. But at the same time, yes, like you mentioned, India and UAE have a swap payment system. India has also and there is also discussion between India and Russia to pay for some of the defense imports in rubles, although that hasn't materialized yet. I think BRICS has indeed the potential to integrate the idea of investing and trading in local currencies even more. As I also argued in the op-ed that you referenced before, they have an interbank cooperation mechanism which allows member countries to settle payments and finance investments in local currencies. And even the NDB, up till 2026 has announced that 30% of the bank's total finance and loans will be denominated in local currencies. So definitely with the coming in of Saudi Arabia and UAE and Iran, it might be possible that oil and petroleum products trade in this particular domain becomes the central focus of financing and utilization of local currencies. It has anyway been happening through the ICM and the NDB loans in BRICS in the past, and it would be an important development, that is to indicate that these countries have agreed to kind of reduce their dependence on the dollar more and more. But again, strategic interests with regards to relations with the West might come into play, and they would want to keep it on the low with regards to not exactly stating that this is an oil based relationship now, which is to be dealt with only in local currencies, but in a way that okay, this already happens in the BRICS. We have an interbank cooperation mechanism, and maybe if we have purchases and trade in oil and petroleum products, it can just be one of the other things that we finance in local denominations.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're running out of time, Anushka, but thank you so much for joining me in this podcast. Extremely interesting, and your point of view was quite enriching. Hope to see more of your analyses on what BRICS is up to as soon as the whole January thing takes place. Thank you once again, Anushka.
Thank you so much, Sachin, for having me.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.